welcome to episode 2 of Pandas on Parade. This time we are talking about elbow cuts.
Elbow cuts.
And all of the fun things that go along with that.
So last episode we did last 2 weeks ago. Last class. We did wrist cuts, and we talked about how wrist cuts are very speedy. In this particular episode, we are going to talk about how elbow cuts are not terribly speedy, but they're not terribly slow either. They're slower than a wrist cut, but they're faster than a shoulder cut. They are less powerful than a shoulder cut and more powerful than a wrist cut. So, does anybody have any questions about anything before we get started? Possibly having to do with wrist cuts from the last episode.
Especially wrist cuts. I hope everybody got a chance to either watch that video or was here during our class on that.
Alright, we should get started. So, we're going to be talking a little bit about the mechanics of the elbow cut. We are going to show you the elbow cuts and how they mechanically work. The types of elbow cuts that you can do, and why they're a fairly balanced cut. Most of the night we're going to be talking about the balancing act between power and speed and how it's equal to distance and time. So that's the equation that we're going to work through for most of tonight, and we will be using German rapier and sabering techniques to illustrate all of these principles that we are going to do. Again, this is mostly a tactics class, so we're going to spend a little bit of time showing you how they work. Then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about why they work, and more importantly, when to use them.
Yeah.
Because that's
kind of what we're after in this class set, is looking at why, where these cuts exist, why they exist, and what are good opportunities to use them. The German rapier, which is akin a lot to what people often call either a transitional side sword technique, is a lot more cut-oriented than our traditional Italian rapier that we look at. And so it's got a really good foundations and a platform for looking at how these elbow cuts interact with different types of techniques and different options on the field. So that's why we're going to be using that. And sabering, which of course is kind of a later period sword form that uses a lot of heavy cutting, but also kind of still a very linear, narrow, stepping lunge mechanic. So we'll look at kind of how they use the elbow to drive those cuts and use those to drive the timing of those actions, and how those cuts start to interact with the grander technique and tactics around it. So
we're going to go ahead and get started, and much the same way we did last time, I'm going to have Lot do the demonstration, and I'm going to point out the various things that he is doing, so that way we can essentially walk and talk at the same time. You ready?
Pat our stomachs.
I'm just never good at that. So, one of the things that we're going to just do to start with is demonstrate the mechanics of the wrist cut. I'm going to have
elbow cut.
Oh, sorry, elbow cuts. My bad. We're going to show you the mechanic with the sword and without a sword, so that way you can see what the arm is supposed to be doing. I'll go ahead and demonstrate without the sword, and then I'll point at you while you do it with the sword. Sound like a plan?
Sure.
Okay. So, with the elbow cut, one of the things that's super important is it is not a jacking motion. It is not a pump. It is not a kind of a snipe. The cut is circular. So, it goes around and above and around. It can go low, it can go high. But it's this mechanic that's here around the elbow. And as you can see with Lot, is that it's kind of the opposite. If I want to hit somebody on the right side, I'm going to start my cut from the left. And if I want to hit them on the left side, I'm going to go in the circle to the right. And this is where they're going to be struck. Any questions on that?
Right. When I start that action, as I start to bring that sword, if I'm in a forward guard, and as I start to bring that sword back, I'm not bringing the sword back in the same line as I'm striking forwards with the sword. I'm actually turning an ellipse with the point of the sword, letting the wrist rotate, using that same opening and closing motion of the hand as I go, and relaxing the elbow into a contracted position so that it can expand forwards again from the side I want to cut on. So I'm not pulling to the right and trying to cut back from the right. I'm actually letting the sword move to the right so that I can then transfer all that momentum and energy to the other side as I cut.
So it's important to note that even though we're primarily using the elbow, it's not all in the elbow. The wrist does come into play. Same with the wrist cuts, where the elbow does come into play. It's not the driving factor behind how the cut gets delivered. Now, the next thing that we're going to show you is I'm going to have Lot do a couple of wrist cuts, and I want you to pay attention to how small and narrow the wrist cut is, and why we say that the wrist cut has speed. Because then we're going to show you what the elbow cut looks like, and the fact that you should notice it gets a little bit bigger, so it slows down. But also pay attention to the power portion of this equation. The wrist cut is going to be very fluid and very small. The elbow cut is going to be a little bit bigger and will be able to generate a little bit more force. Now, force does not mean what you hit your opponent with. It just means the power that is behind the sword and behind the action. You should not ever be hitting somebody hard enough that they go, ugh! So I just want to put that out there. That force does not equal impact to the person that you're on the other side with. So everybody got that? Super important.
Right.
All right.
We're talking about generating strength with the cut through the whole body and stability with that cut. When we start talking about this later in how this cut interacts with the blade, it's a much stronger cut in the forte as you throw the blow, right? So when I throw that wrist cut, just that turning wrist cut that we did last week,
so notice
rotating the wrist.
Notice how fast that is. And do a smaller wrist cut. Can you do any smaller ones?
This?
Yeah. So you can also see how quick those are. It's a very finessey kind of cut, for a lack of a better term. So go ahead and now do the same with the elbows. So, can you see the speed in which Lot is now using his elbow to deliver the same types of actions towards the opponent, but now using the elbow instead of the wrist? The motion is slower, but does have more power behind it.
Yeah, more strength and stability. If I hit the pelt.
Yep, go ahead and hit the pelt.
With those actions, there's kind of my wrist cut. I don't know if you guys can kind of hear the difference through the pelt.
Or see the pelt swinging back and forth.
But you can kind of, the stability that is out here in my cut when I throw that is a lot. When I'm just throwing the wrist, it's quick, it's fast. But when I'm throwing the elbow, all of this, the whole sword comes forwards into the space that I want to both cover with my blade and attack with my with the striking edge of my sword, like we talked about last week or last class.
All right. So I'm gonna hit against the pelt, and again, I want to show you the force or the power behind something, and then a little bit of this is power that's too much, and we don't need to be hitting that hard. So I have my elbow cuts, I've got my rotation, this is my wrist. Okay, and that's got a good amount of power to it. What we don't ever want to be seeing, oh, that's a shoulder cut. We don't ever want to be seeing that. We don't ever want to have somebody hit with so much force that the pelt actually reverberates back through your sword. We don't need to do it that hard at all. Your arm will not thank you, your opponent will not thank you. So again, power does not equate to force of the person on the other end of the sword.
Yeah, and again, we referenced the calibration video I put up last time. This same holds true with this action when we're throwing this cutting motion. That we aren't we can direct all that impact into the ground as we go, and we don't have to slam the sword into our opponent or even into their sword to be safe. The key elements to being safe and making sure that you don't have to rush your cuts is keeping your strong in front of you as you throw the blow, so when that blow comes in, I'm not stepping forwards and then trying to strike my blow. I'm throwing my blow and stepping behind it. I'm landing my foot as my sword impacts with my opponent. And I'm keeping my sword angled in front so that when I strike my target, my hand is leading the cut behind the edge, so that I'm not striking my pel or my target with my hand on the same side of my body as the strike. I want my hand to be past my target so that as I impact that, I'm going to leverage my opponent's sword and keep safe as I do that, and then I don't have to rush my cut and try to get out. I'm not bouncing my cut off of anybody. I'm not whipping my point in there. I'm just making a nice, easy rotation of the sword, whether it's coming from below, and you can see that my hand is high and my point is low. As it finishes, it can even come all the way through if I do that right. If I don't do that, this is where my blade stops, and I can't go any further, and that's no good because I've hyperextended my elbow and I haven't protected my head from a counter cut. So we want to lead with our hand and strike through our target, past our target, so that when we impact, our blade is in the quadrant we want to strike and our hand is in the opposite quadrant to that, just like we've done on our cutting diagram with our wrist cuts and in the other cutting techniques that we've looked at.
So, as you can see, I've started to armor up because we're going to put on masks for a moment, and we're going to show you, continue on the theme of elbow cuts are a balance between power and speed and time and distance. So the way that balance happens is through the negotiation of space. And everything that we do from now on, we're going to be kind of framing in that sort of sphere of how are we balancing the two sides of this equation, because that really is the foundations for elbow cuts.
Right. Yeah, we've talked about how fast wrist cuts are, and it makes sense why we want to throw these wrist cuts at the time when we chose to throw them. And we looked specifically at an example where if I threw my elbow cut instead of a wrist cut, my opponent would stab me in the face. And the answer to this conundrum is that distance equals time, and time allows us to complete larger actions in the same cooperative tempo with our opponent. Tempo is a relationship between two actions. And so if we have time and space to throw larger cuts, we can. Let's do that example real quick.
Yeah, so we're going to do that example for you so we can show the negotiation of space and how it's going to go really poorly for Jeff.
Yeah, I gotta wear my helmet.
The other thing that's super important to keep in mind is as we're doing this balancing act, it is going to be very obvious when you should and should not do this, because an elbow cut takes about a full tempo to do. Because of the larger action, you need more time for it. Whereas the wrist cut, you can do it in half a tempo. You can steal time very easily and quite nicely. Elbow cuts get a little bit funky.
So this first demonstration is going to be the same demonstration we did in the last class, where Panda's going to be in that Spanish guard. And I'm going to be in a German guard this time, but neither one of us will have claimed the center in this case. We'll both be at what we call equal swords, or relatively equal swords, because hers is probably in a better leverage position since she has the advantage of the right angle. Right. But that's okay. What's going to happen is then I'm going to pick up my sword to throw that elbow cut, and we're going to see how she can enter in that time and totally take away any opportunity I have to actually cut, right? So this should be probably pretty familiar to everybody, but I'm now in a German guard, and she's in proper measure with her Spanish guard. And we looked at this with both of us in Spanish, where I opened up, and then as she stepped in, I kind of stepped out and threw the wrist cut to defend myself. But in this case, I want to throw an elbow cut. So I've assumed a guard that's prepped a little bit for the elbow cut, right? So my elbow's a little softer, and I'm ready to go. Because if I'm already out here, throwing an elbow cut is actually much more difficult.
We haven't shown that one. That's what we were supposed to show.
That's right. So when I pick this up to throw an elbow cut, there's nowhere for me to go. Even if I go forwards, even if I launch into this, I'm getting stabbed well before I can do anything about it, right? There's no way I can get around that sword. I can't get from here to here or anything else like that. I can't do anything.
And I'm super protected because
right.
The only place that they're going to go is right into my guard.
So now we're going to expand the measure a little bit, and I'm going to start that action a little earlier. So here I am now in my new German guard, in a better German measure in this case for this. And I'm going to throw that cut, and she might try to come in on it. And you can see that now I can expand forwards and take a lot of that away. She wants to go backwards. She doesn't necessarily want to have anything to do with this cut because it's coming in a lot stronger than my wrist cut would be if I did the same thing with a wrist cut. So I'll throw the wrist cut, and you can enter again. And we can see that from my position, because I had the soft elbow, the wrist cut isn't going to do as much because I don't have that extended arm that we looked at in the last class. Of one of the caveats for the wrist cut is you want your arm already out there. Because my arm is already supple, because it's now retracted a little bit, it's prepared for an elbow cut. I need to measure the distance so that I can fit that cut in and place it in that time of the entry. So I can deflect the blow and strike behind it and stay safe in that tempo. So that's sort of one of the key caveats to how we manage this distance a little bit better when it comes to elbow cuts. I got to have the time to make it work. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. So the closer I am to my opponent, as soon as I get into here, this is a bad place to be throwing elbow cuts. I could throw them, but I better be doing it getting the heck out of dodge, because I need all of that time and space.
Because I'm just going to chase him down, because I have the advantage at this point.
Yeah. And in that cut, I'll just note a little bit on the mechanics of that. Because I knew I wanted to cut on the same side of the sword, I didn't pull my sword straight back to cut. I actually turned my sword to my left before throwing out to my right. And you can see in that rotation of this action, my hand doesn't actually stay on a straight line, and my sword doesn't rotate at my wrist. It actually rotates in the middle of my blade. The point of rotation in this wrist cut is right down there. And that's about the point I actually want to be throwing at my opponent's sword, especially when I'm attacking. The same concept is if I'm attacking into my opponent's sword, and we looked at this last week as well, I want to be using this part of my blade to attack into the sword. So I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to use this part of my blade to attack into the weapon. We don't need mass for this, so I'm not going to be hitting you. I'm going to be hitting at your sword.
What? Since we're SCA and society,
that's fine. You can put your mask on. That's fine.
Safety
That's
first.
good. Safety third. All right. So I'm negotiating this by, again, extending distance, because I want to be further away from my opponent, because I don't want to be even reaching at them. I want to be reaching at their sword. So I'm even a little bit further away, and I can throw that same action, and now this time I'm going to strike at the sword instead of my opponent. And just with a little bit of a step and that elbow cut, I'm going to take this part of my blade, I'm going to drive it into the middle of my opponent's blade, just like we looked at last week, 2 weeks ago, right? I can get, you notice how much further away that blade goes because of the impact that I've thrown at it.
Right, and it takes a lot less effort to get my blade to move out of the way. And that's where the power comes in.
So this is kind of the fundamentals of the mechanics of what we're looking at for this cut. So does that kind of cover people's questions on sort of the mechanics, or this is kind of a good idea of how to throw this cut and why this cut kind of exists in contrast to the wrist cut that we looked at last time? Maybe?
Nothing on my end.
No questions? Well, that's good. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Right. This is something that we can practice, right? We want to have a nice loose arm when you do this. You don't want to be tightened up. You don't want to be stressed out. Remember, opening and closing the hand, it's now the same. We've transferred that principle into the elbow, and you can see that it makes a little ellipse in my arm as I do this. I'm not going straight forwards and straight back. These swords don't work that way, right?
Yeah, we're not punching.
We're not punching, and you get the nice light modern saber, if you've done Olympic saber, and that sword goes forwards and back real easily and real quick. These heavier blades don't, and it's really critical that we support this method with mechanics.
All right. So we're going to move into talking a little bit about the German and what this means for our balanced equation. Proper distance. We just covered the proper distance means that you can hit your opponent against their counterattack.
Yeah, if they're going to be coming at you, you should be able to strike through their sword and into their head. You can, like we said, you can do this as a cut against their weapon, and that's also a tactic we'll look at using this cut for. It can be very defensive, especially against somebody who's going to attack from a wide measure, like an Italian, or as they're stepping into measure, or as they're trying to attack you. You can drive their cut away and counter strike with this action.
Yeah, it's super important, to note that even though I was in the right angle, I did not have honest measure for where a Spaniard wants to be. Lot was out of my distance. There's no way that I could have lunged or stepped and actually hit him.
Right.
So I was really not in a good position for a Spaniard to be in.
And this comes down to negotiating that measure as you enter the fight. It's one of the reasons why you'll notice a number of people on the field, especially in the SCA, people creep up against the marshal staff. And other people go driving themselves against the list rope because they want to get as far from you as possible. And there's actually, I've actually seen it and had it and done it where I've been like, hey, you need to start over there. Because there is a section of the fight that is the approach as you enter measure against your opponent, and if you get somebody who's essentially manipulating the courtesy rules of how and when we start the fight by jumping in as close as possible before the fight begins, that's an unfair advantage that they're trying to take stock of, or they're at least cutting out a section of the fight that you can use to take advantage of. And if you're not fighting as you approach your opponent, you're always going to be one step behind them. So as soon as they call lay on, and as soon as you start negotiating that space, it's absolutely critical that you be aware of how close you're getting to your opponent with every step you make.
And especially here in Caid, not every kingdom has as generous of a list size as we do. Qaid has in the rules that it's a 40-foot list, which is, fairly generous and pretty large. We have...
And not always accurate.
Not always accurate, but still some bigger lists than we even have at Penzig. And that's super important. So if you're playing a range game, knowing your list and knowing the size of your list, and as Lot says, the things that you can do in the onset become really important. And these elbow cuts, especially as you're trying to gain time and distance, become a lot more effective. Where a Spaniard wants to be in a fight and where an Italian wants to be in a fight are in two opposite different locations.
Right.
Spaniard wants to be in honest measure. We want to be able to reach out and touch you. Italian wants no part of that.
Right, but it doesn't mean that because you're fighting Spanish, I get to let you start there.
Right.
Yeah. That's part of, even in Spanish fencing, part of the critical essence of how we fight, and this is what we looked at with the atajos and approaching the opponent, is how we get from out of measure to in measure, because
all of that becomes important.
Very important.
So we are going to move into the portion where we start talking about the larger responses from the opponent and how they defend against a cut. And so we're going to talk about setting off and slicing off, which are two German concepts.
We're going to look at some German concepts, right? That
are super helpful everywhere else.
Right. That you'll see variations of this in all sorts of forms and constructs when it comes to what can we do against this cut. Because essentially what I've done is I've designed this element to take away my opponent's thrust or force them into a larger defensive action than they would have to make against my wrist cut. So if I just throw a wrist cut, we looked at kind of the ability to use that in time and when is a bad idea to use that, and how kind of easy it is to parry that wrist cut when it's done out of tempo. And so we wanted to be doing that wrist cut sort of on the back end of actions or when we've been pushed offline. But in this case, we're actually claiming space with this elbow cut because of the strength of the cut.
Right.
Because of the stability of the body that I'm putting behind this cut, I can actually enter with this blow as a very strong blow, or I can counterattack a thrust against me with this blow. And what this is going to do is then drive my opponent to have to make a wider defense. And the Germans use two different defenses conceptually. There's a number of different them, but fundamentally there's the idea of setting off your opponent in sort of a quadrant guard and counter thrusting at them from that position. And then there's the idea of counter cutting against their blade or slicing off. So setting off is when we catch their blade with our blade and we move into a counter thrust, and slicing off is when we use our own cut against the opponent's incoming cut. So it takes, again, we've talked about how the cut covers a swath. It covers that whole area. So while you're cutting at me, if I just try to parry, if I don't get that parry right, you're going to leverage over my cut and you're going to hit me in the head. And the more I try to reach forwards against you, the less angle I have to defend the angle of your cut. But by setting that off with more of an angle, or by slicing it off with a countercut of my blade, I can take away a larger portion of your attack, or I can defend a larger portion of my body with my sword. So we should look at kind of how that's done. You think?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to use actions to back all those words up.
Yeah. So we'll both be in the sort of German guard, right? And in this case, since again we're at even swords and we're now at a negotiated measure where these cuts are useful, Alison's going to throw that blow through my sword and into my head, and if I counter thrust her blade should displace mine.
So where am I going? I go to the wrist?
Right, so she displaced my blade and hits me at the same time. I can try to make that a little bit narrower. You just keep going, make sure you cut through. Don't pull it. Right? She's still defending against my cut and hitting me in the head. So what I'm going to do now is, instead of trying to make my defense here, which is giving her the depth to hit me in the head, I'm going to lift my sword into the quadrant and defend a much higher line with my blade. So now I've defended that line, and I can easily counter thrust into her head, right? And the difference in that is, instead of just putting my sword here, I've actually turned my whole edge up into the way of the incoming blade. It aligns my arm behind my sword, aligns my edge against the incoming stroke, and now I get more strength and stability in the forte of my sword to catch that. Whereas if I'm just sort of counter thrusting with a flat hand, she's going to catch the flat of my blade and power through into my head, right? This works on both sides. It works from cuts from below. I can, again, turn my edge up and defend that outside high line, right? And I can turn my edge down and into a cut that's coming up from below, or down and into a cut that's coming up from the other side. All the while I can keep my point online. This is okay if I know what my timing is, and if I know I can catch that blade, and I'm ready to commit to that thrust. Setting off can be really, really good. But sometimes I'm not sure exactly where that blow is coming in from, or I've already done a thing and now I've got a much wider angle and I need to use more momentum of my sword to strike her out of the way. This time you're going to throw a cut. So let's say I've come over into the low guard on my left, and you're going to throw a cut now to my high left side, and I'm just going to throw that Unterhau to slice it away. Right, so I can catch that blade and cut it away from me, either high. I can cut it low, so throw a low, or a horizontal cut. I can cut down on that sword and throw it low, and I can just slice that blade away. And these become two really good defenses against a powerful cut that's coming in on a line that that has been opened for one reason or another. Does that make sense about how these defenses work? You'll notice that when I do these are bigger actions than that initial sort of parry or counter thrust that we looked at earlier in the actions, right? So by setting off, by turning my blade into that space, and by angling against that weapon, or by slicing off with my sword, I'm creating a larger action to defend myself than I would have to if my opponent were thrusting at me, or were maybe throwing a wrist cut if they had the time and space to do that. Is that pretty clear too? You can try this out for yourself too, and trying to do much smaller actions against powerful cuts, and sometimes you can get them to work and defend if you do it right, especially if you negotiate measure really well. But one of the reasons why these cuts exist is to drive those smaller parries away,
right.
And wear you out when you do that. This is good for me as someone who's throwing these cuts, because what I've done now is initiated an engagement where my opponent has to make this larger action to defend themselves.
Right, and it takes me a long time to actually recover from this, because my sword is way offline.
Right. So if Panda's going to be defending against me with one of these actions, I'm throwing an elbow cut in order to force her to do this. And that's the critical element that I need to recognize to start, is that part of the goal of negotiating this measure, of starting this cut early, from out of distance with a larger action, or not out of distance, but in the wider measure, is I want my opponent to have to throw a larger defensive action against me. And when I do, I can take advantage of that time. Because now what I can do is I can pull my cut and chase to the opening on the other side of the sword. The place they left is always a really good place to strike.
Right.
So if I have an opponent who's in a low guard, maybe on the right, and I throw, or on their right, I'm going to throw a nice elbow cut at their head on their left side, on my right side. This is going to force them to make one of those larger defenses, and as they're doing that, I will stop the cut, abbreviate it, and turn it into my next action. This is just thrown very similarly to the way a feint is thrown, where I start my engagement, I stop it, and I turn and keep going, as opposed to trying to pump my arm to get someplace else. I don't want to throw two cuts. I want to throw one cut. So again, I have some mechanics on how to pull your cut in my longswords videos, but it works the same with a single-handed weapon.
Right. So the Germans call this pulling.
Yeah, the Italians call it feinting, or the French call it feinting. The English probably call it feinting or faking.
Yeah, so basically it's, does my opponent give me an action that I fall for and go, oh, I really need to protect myself against this, and then they're going to change it on me as I'm already committed into something. So it's super effective. Again, feint, pull, whatever you want to call it. It's a way of changing what you're doing kind of midstream in a response to me giving a really big action.
And so again, I've negotiated the wider measure. I don't want to be too close. I'm using a larger action that I'm kind of counting on my opponent to see. If they don't see it, or if they don't defend well enough, I'll just power through and finish. And by power through, I mean just create stability and finish, not try to hit harder. I'm just going to finish my blow.
Either way, this goes poorly for the person on the other side.
Do you want to parry poorly first? Yeah, parry poorly first. Just make a small parry with flat.
So are we going from...
Yeah, from there. So she's given me an opening. She's assumed a low guard, and I'm taking advantage of this to cut to the head, right? She's going to even try to counter thrust or whatever you want to do, right? There it was. I came in, I got contact on the head. She tried to pull that up to her head. Now she's going to give a nice counter stroke against it, and I'm just going to continue. This way we'll show the success. Right? So she's turned the edge against it. She's made her success. I tried to reach as far as I can. I can't get there. But now, as I see that action coming, and as I see her arm coming in, so I know that she's going to get that defense, I'm just going to pull it. And I strike up from below in that time.
Alright, so this is a yeah, but moment. You ready for this one? Yeah, but if I see that they have changed their line, can I do anything about it and change my line back? You could try it. Again, we're going nice and slow.
Right. We're going nice and slow. But the critical element is if I pull the cut as I'm going forwards and as she's making her defense, and when I finish my blow, I defend the line where her sword is as I finish. I don't have to rush. I don't have to move fast. Even if she comes back down and tries to hit me, I'm defended against that attack. Right? Does that make sense?
So we're gonna do this again in slow, and I'm gonna show you yeah, but, and what my brain says. But I should be able to do this thing in counter, and then we're gonna speed it up to actual speed, so you can see that no, yeah, but doesn't necessarily work in this case. You ready? Okay, so we're going to do the same drill that we just did. We're going to do it nice and slow. So I'm down here in this nice low guard. and he's going to give me the trick. I'm going to come up here, and I can go, well, yeah, but I can just turn my hand down. Maybe that'll work. Or if I'm here, it gives me the thing, and maybe I go this way. And I kind of got a little bit of success on that. But again, we're going nice and slow, so let's do it at speed. You ready?
Yeah. You're not wearing elbow pads.
Yeah, don't hit me in the elbow.
Okay.
I'm still dead. Okay, so you see how that goes? And why the yeah but doesn't necessarily also work in this instant here.
Yeah.
So there's just not enough time, even if I can recognize the fact that they have pulled a feint and I fell for it, there's not a lot I can do.
Yeah, I mean, there's negotiating measure backwards, and there are some things that you can do, but it's a really hard tempo to be in, and the key element is I'm safe. The action that she made to try to get at my sword pulled her arm in, and therefore the weak of her sword struck the strong of my blade in a way that didn't move my blade at all. It fell off into the space between us.
And he could just keep going.
And I could just stay in the center and keep my actions going wherever I wanted them to go.
Any questions on that?
Okay,
So I'll show it. What I'll do is I'll show it both ways. I'm going to start with a thrust that becomes a wrist cut, and then I'll do it with an elbow cut that becomes another elbow cut. Okay. Right. So we start with the action that leads to the wrist cut. Like last time we said, I'm starting as an Italian, and I've taken a little bit of that center line, and she's parrying me, and then there's my wrist cut, and I was talking, so I messed that up, so let's do that with a little bit better balance. There's my wrist cut. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw an elbow cut, and if you're going to try to do that same parry against my elbow cut. So she's going to try to do the same parry against my elbow cut.
The same parry?
Yeah, just the same parry. I'm going to negotiate a little bit better margin for myself. Right?
Yeah.
Right? You can see that she didn't want any piece of that. She moved away. Right? So now she's going to do the right parry against my elbow cut. Right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my elbow cut midway through. Right? So we see how the grosser actions on my end lead to grosser actions on my opponent's end and allow me to do more within that space with larger actions. That's kind of the key element of what we're looking at, of the difference between these cuts and when and how you want to throw them. If I throw that whole elbow cut out there, especially with my body, and I wait till I'm parried before I throw another cut, I'm going to be in trouble because of all of the momentum and strength and stability that I've put into that elbow cut is much larger than the thrust, especially that turns into a wrist cut. And if I try to do the elbow cut post parry from the thrust, what'll happen is I will take too much time turning my sword over, and my opponent will then stab me in between that.
Right.
So by having the extended measure, by using a stronger cut and forcing my opponent to respond in a stronger fashion, this gives me the time and space to make my cut work and to pull the cut to go to the next action.
So is everybody seeing the concept that we were talking about, where this is an entire game of balance between power and speed and time and distance? Is that there's a give and take on both sides to get the right equation to get that balance between everything you need to do, comes in.
Can I see it one more time on the pull cut? I just want to see your feet, where your feet.
Okay.
My feet or his feet or both?
Probably my feet, right?
His feet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to see how the transition, I guess.
Right. So what you're going to see, and when we record this, I'll slow it down so you can really see it in slow motion. But what you're going to see is that as I'm coming out, my foot is not moving until the final bit of my cut. So if I step, I'm done. So I need to make sure I'm throwing that action out and getting out there to about here where I threaten my opponent. And once they start to move, then I'm going to pull my cut around, and I'm not pulling back on the elbow. I'm just rotating and continuing my elbow forward as I rotate my wrist. So we're combining those actions. It's not a wrist cut, it's still an elbow cut, because everything's still generating with this same fluid motion.
So this whole exchange requires me to buy in on his elbow cut that he's not actually going to throw. So if he moves his foot while he throws the elbow, he's kind of committing to that action. If he gives me the illusion and the feint that he is going to throw the cut but doesn't move his foot, there's only so many areas in his body I can pay attention to. And so I'm generally going to be paying attention to the part with the sword as a general rule, because that's the part that can hurt me. So if I buy in on that action that he is going to throw the elbow cut and his foot's not moving and I don't catch that, shame on me, because that's when he can pull it and go in the other direction. But if he steps without actually and he has to commit to it. Otherwise, I kind of get the advantage back.
Right. And the other thing I'm doing is, while I'm starting that cut, is I'm watching my opponent. I'm watching for three things. One, are they doing anything at all?
Right.
Are they blocking the cut that's incoming, or are they stabbing me in a way that my sword isn't on line for? And if it's number three, I'm going to reorient my cut to address where their sword is going midway through, in a way that I, again, always send my strong towards their weak. So we'll do that. We'll do that twice. Yeah, that's what I had talked about a little bit earlier. So
right, let's get elbows.
Yeah, well, you're getting elbows.
Okay.
So let's do the first one, where she doesn't do anything at all, and then we'll essentially do the third one where she's going to just stab up from below without defending necessarily the cut. But if I continue on my line, we're going to get doubled. And then we'll do the third one again, where we do what we just did, where she moves for that actual good defense. And all three times you'll see where and when my foot moves, and it's always the same place.
Right.
So you're going to try to gut me while I'm... So this is where this goes bad. You're just going to stab up. So I'm going to throw that cut for your head, and you're going to stab. Right? See how bad that goes? Right. So I'm watching for that, and when that happens, I'm going to bring my hand down to address the sword. Right? So it doesn't really matter where I'm cutting up here. I'm threatening her head. If she comes in that line, I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to strike for the shoulder and the sword at the same time.
Because if he doesn't, we're both dead.
Right? So I'm watching for that. Now, if she doesn't do anything at all, right, I can just step in and hit her. Now, when she throws that proper cut, right? You see how she didn't even know where my sword was going, even though it's going the same place every time, because she's still mentally looking at this. If we stop that right here, right? You see that my foot hasn't moved forwards yet. I'm out in front and she's moving up, and now I can pull that sword around and keep your momentum going, right?
Man, I'm still not getting back in time.
And we'll see this in slow motion too. Let me make sure my camera's in. Right? You can see how much time it takes for her to actually recognize that my sword has left the space.
Right, and even if we do it in real time and I can see that his sword is left, I can't get back in time.
Right, because anything she does to come down on my sword is in position to defend my head. If my head is open because I've thrown into that flank and haven't lifted my guard to defend myself, that's going to be a problem for me on either an afterblow or a double or all sorts of things that could happen in that moment.
Right.
Is your toe still pointing at the center? Right? When you do the left minute?
My toe is pointed in the direction in which my weight is going. So, so there's a couple of things here at play. Again, this kind of gets back into angular mechanics. We're going to talk a lot more about this with shoulder cuts in our next episode.
Yep.
But fundamentally, the idea is if I'm stepping, I want to be reorienting because we're playing in the round, right? This is not a linear thing. So as I'm reorienting my weight, I want, I am a very large proponent of period footwear and period foot techniques, which means staying on the balls of your feet and not landing on your heels, and using a shorter step with a larger lean. If you, I don't know, you can't really see my shirt anymore, but you can kind of see that figure there, the Meyer-esque figure, how far he's in guard and leaning forwards. And we'll actually look at a little bit of difference when we look at sabering at the end of the night. But fundamentally, with German rapier, especially because it's an earlier form, and it's a different foot gear, and there's some differences to the weapon that, and I do this with Italian rapier as well, a little bit in Spanish, but the Spanish are a little more upright. But the idea is we're using a short step, and that allows us to lean forward onto the ball of our foot and activate our knee without risking the shearing torque on our knee.
So can
this is
demonstrate this one real quick?
If you like, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate this a little bit just because footwork is awesome. So we're going to take a slight tangent, but we're going to come right back. Okay, so one of the things that Lot does with all of his students generally is correct our balance and how we stand. But one of the things that he's talking about is that it's a little bit bent in the knees. The feet are, I'm on the balls of my feet. I'm here. I'm leaned forward. My chin is up. And this is a really nice balanced position. And from here, I can go sideways. I can go diagonally. I can go in any number of directions. And then when I come back, I'm still in that nice balanced state. And and Meyer even has it a little bit more leaning forward. Spanish is still that same concept. They're a little more upright. Yep. But that shift in the balance point in your hips and in where you're sitting over your knees allows the balance to happen without twerking your feet, without twerking your knees.
And so then the idea becomes, and here I'll shift up. The idea is that as I move at different angles, right? And so here I am, I'm on the balls of my feet. I've got that weight a little bit shifted forward. Mine looks a hair different than Pandas. It's because our bodies are a little shaped differently. Mm-hmm. And our weight's distributed a little differently, and that's okay. But fundamentally is that when if I step this direction, and I'm going into my opponent, I'm going to rotate my knee and toe into the angle which I'm stepping. If I'm stepping this way and I'm rotating out against my opponent, I'm going to angle my knee and toe into the angle that I'm putting my weight. What I don't want to be doing is stepping this way and rotating that way.
Right.
Because that's where you can see the shearing torque on my knee, and my whole body's going one direction. I'm gonna pop something back here or in the front of my knee, all sorts of different ways to go. But I can lunge this way and lean that way, and I can thrust that direction, but cutting's very difficult. So when I cut, I'm going to take my foot, and if I step around my opponent this direction, you can see that my foot ends up a little bit straight, and then I finish by rotating back into that line. So when I throw this cut, I'm starting to make a step that would end with a rotation here. But what happens is I start that motion, and then I change that motion, and it ends this way. Because what I want is my stability in this line.
Right.
Right? So if I do this going forwards, this is my primary step, but then when I change that step, I'm actually coming back this direction. You can see that my knee and my toe are now pointed that way, because that's where I want my weight to be aligned. Does that make sense?
And we'll cover this much more detail when we do shoulder cuts, because this becomes I don't want to say more relevant, but it's more important.
We're going to be doing a lot more angular stepping,
right,
from side to side when we deal with shoulder cuts, because those take a lot more space, and we'll get to that in that way. But you can start to also see the relationship between space and size of cut, right, and how we can manipulate that space by assuming different distances, and that's kind of the key element here. Is if I do these elbow cuts when I'm really close to my opponent, they are going to thrust me over. I'm going to get hit over and over and over again because I do not have the time to complete these cuts. Right. But if I do them with space, not only do I have the time to complete the cut, I can use them to their advantage by forcing my opponent into a larger action. Right. And I still have room to change the fight mid-stroke, as opposed to getting caught in a parry or getting counter thrust before I can turn my sword from side to side.
So the one note I want to add to this before we continue into our when do we use elbow cuts, the best part of the night, is that physics is still our friend. This is still, geometry and physics based exercise with elbow cuts. We don't get away from that in any of the cutting forms. Because leverage is still important, and knowing when to change the angle is also very important. And I will let you know that distance is relative. So depending upon the size of weapons that you are fighting with, and if you and your opponent have significantly different heights and significantly different weapons, the distance that you're going to want to be in is going to change. So if you're fighting somebody who is 6'4", with a 44-inch blade, and you are 5'5", sure, we'll call it that, 5'5",
that's what my doctor says,
with a 38-inch blade, that's a big world of difference in blade size, height, and what the range between these two opponents. So where that 6'4" person wants to be and where the 5'5" person wants to be are going to be in different spaces.
Right.
So,
but that also goes back into how you use the approach to get to a place where you can actually strike your opponent. That's a whole different class on tall versus short. But fundamentally, we're using the space between us, and I can use that space to strike at my opponent, or I can use that space to strike through their weapon and claim what I call space-time. Space-time, by removing their weapon from the center, I can then get closer and I can create a safe bubble for myself inside of their sword. That's actually the next action that we're leading into. Doubling, right?
So, again, distance is relative. Creating the safe bubble is what's important. And understanding that distance is going to be different between your opponents. The one advantage that Lot and I have is there's only about an inch of difference between us, give or take, and generally our weapons are about the same size. So it's as near of a perfect world as far as fighting goes as possible-ish.
Our footwork's a little.
Footwork is a lot different.
We have very different leg spans, so that can change things too.
Right.
How tall, how much leg your opponent has versus their torso, how much they're leaning versus upright. These can all change the various different range, and it can change what's based on what style they're using. Whether they're using a Spanish style where they're not lunging and they're staying more upright, or they're using this German style where they're throwing bigger cuts in earlier tempos, or even a Saber style, which we'll look at, or we looked at the Italian style. We've also looked at all sorts of other different SCA styles of different variations, and how they operate and can operate based off of the space-time that they use with their bodies. So in this case, we're using an elongated elbow cut to claim space, which is really, really good. We could do this using a Spanish methodology, using a different approach, because sometimes we have to. You can work from an atajo into an elbow cut as well, based off of what you're provoking from your opponent to make. And we can, So
we should talk about doubling.
Let's look at another way of controlling that time, because we've looked a little bit at some straight cuts. Like I can enter with a cut, I can cut at my opponent's sword. These are all good things for me to do as I'm kind of negotiating that measure. And one of those is going to be this. Another variant of this is something that the Germans call doubling, which is instead of essentially throwing a cut in one tempo and then returning the next cut sort of in the next half tempo, or in your opponent's response. So let's look at that a little bit, just slowly. So I have an opponent who is threatening me with their sword. Most maybe with an elbow cut stance, kind of a nice German stance. For instance, it doesn't really have to be. It could be Spanish. It could be any of these things, right? And they, I don't really like that sword pointed at me. It doesn't give me a good opening to attack, because her response to that wide cut is going to be much smaller than if she was in that low guard, for instance. So what I'm going to do is try to take that sword out of the way. And one of those ways I can do that is by throwing my cut into the weapon, right? And then in the next tempo, I could return a cut to the head. What often happens in that time is my opponent takes that momentum and tries to throw it against me by pulling it around and cutting at me from the other side. So I can throw that, and then they cut around, and I make another counter stroke into their weapon. And all of this is still good for me. It's an option, but it's essentially 2 tempos. It's 2 strokes. With doubling, what I'm going to do, this is going to look very familiar. I'm essentially going to turn an elbow cut into another elbow cut or even a wrist cut. And I'm going to cut the same stroke again from the same side. Because what I'm doing is I'm driving my opponent out of that space. And instead of claiming that space and then attacking in this new line, I'm just going to take that and drive it out and immediately attack into the next line as a double, right? It doubles the stroke, and it tends to come a little faster because I'm using the momentum of my cut to drive the next one.
Physics, not my friend in this case.
Right? So even if she were to try to get a response in there somewhere. Sorry, you okay?
All right.
Right?
That's a response. Not a good one. Oh,
yeah, not a good response. There's
it's a very natural SCA
right.
response. Is throw your hand
Throw
up.
your hand up and get hit in the hand. So because I've taken her sword out of the way, there isn't really a lot for her to do with it except for try to recover it. And in that moment, I'm already throwing my next cut. Because I'm using the momentum of the sword, the angular momentum to continue the action. And I'm making short steps to facilitate quick cuts, right? I'm not throwing this back around. If I did that with a shoulder cut, yeah, ready? I'll do the first with an elbow cut and then the second with a shoulder cut. You can see she's getting her blade around. She watched me. She sat there for half a second and watched me and then moved her sword up to get it because I pulled that around with that shoulder cut and I gave her so much time and vision on that cut. But by driving the elbow cut into 2 short strokes or turning it from an elbow cut into a wrist cut, I can double the stroke on the same side and keep the momentum of my sword going. And it shortens tempo just a little bit. This speaks to kind of that conversation we had about relative action in tempo. Another way that I can shorten my responses, and this is where we start understanding the guard structures that are outside of our normal sort of SCA expertise. Most of the time when people look at SCA rapier fighting, we're all in either that Italian guard, right, with our sword forward, the Spanish guard with our sword forward. Even this retreated guard has the point forwards, right? And all of these actions, or this sort of center guard, just sort of this, I don't call it a lazy guard, but it's just sort of this sort of middle place
Novice SCA guard.
Right. It's not quite the Spanish guard. It's not quite the Italian guard, but it's somewhere here in the middle where I'm nice and fluid in my elbow, but still my point's online. In all of these cases, in order to throw my cut, really whether it's an elbow cut, if it's a wrist cut with my arm extended, or an elbow cut because my elbow is bent and prepped, I still have to pull my sword back before I throw this cut. And that is tempo. We can shave some of that tempo off by using a guard that is already prepped for a cut, right? So for instance, this is Meyer's high guard on the right for a cut, right? You want to face the camera and show that, right? So Meyer's high guard on the right for a cut, and Meyer's high guard on the left for a cut. The sword is pointed backwards, and it's already prepped for a cut, which means what? It means we've now removed that tempo of pulling back, and we can be prepared and loose to send our sword forwards in the line we want to go.
Can we thrust from this position?
Can you thrust from this position? Well, Meyer makes a distinguishment on this in that he has two high guards on the right. He has high guard on the right for the cut and high guard on the right for the thrust. And this should look familiar to any person who's studied a little bit of German, and also for earlier tonight, in which my opponent cut at my cut here, and I take that offline, and I end up in this position with my point pointed forwards, and then I can thrust at my opponent from there. This is a really good position for a thrust. But if I want to cut from here, what do I have to do? I have to pull my sword back and then launch my cut. So I have to go to high guard for the cut and then launch my cut, even if it's one smooth motion where it goes whoop, it still transitions through that position. And if I'm here, I have to pull my point forwards before I can thrust again. So if we think about this in terms of our wrist cut lesson, where if our point is offline, it's faster to cut, and if our point is online, it's faster to thrust. The same sort of holds true here, which is why you see these positions, even a low guard like this in Meyer, which is the finish of a cut, can be used with a slashing motion to make my next cut, or a rotation of the hand into a long edge cut, which is much faster than if my point is online, and now I have to rotate the whole sword back before I send it forwards again. So if we look at that a little bit, we can start to see why we see these guards in our positions and in our place, where the sword is back here as I'm entering measure. And now, do I want to be here in this guard? No, this is a bad place to be in this guard, because we're too close. And now we're playing a game of cut chicken, and that's no good. But if I'm out here, and even if my opponent's got a forward pointed guard, right, just a Spanish even, right, or Iron Gate or whatever, and my opponent wants to thrust at me from here, I can still throw that elbow cut very quickly and defensively against my opponent. If I do it with a little bit of that step out that we did with the Atajo and our wrist cuts, it works exactly the same way. I'm just prepped for an elbow cut because my elbow's bent, my sword is here, right? So I can use that distance to negotiate, and I can prep my cut by starting with my sword already in a guard that all I have to do from here is launch forwards. And you can see the reaction time to that is much smaller than if we're starting with our sword forwards and I prep with the cut. But again, when we look at like German rapier especially, using this as our example for tonight, you see these guard positions. You don't see this lean back, swept out, arm extended starting places. You see positions like this as my starting spots, because all of these are positions that I can easily turn and throw a cut as my opening action, right? Whereas if I'm starting with my blade already forwards, I have to pull that blade back before I can throw a cut. I've limited myself with my point forwards to playing a point only game, or maybe throwing a couple of wrist cuts like the Spanish do, the atajos, as my, let's say, initial gambit. And if I have more flexibility with my cuts, I can start from a position like here, and if I don't like it, I can change off and say, okay, they're in a point forward position, and here I am, and I'm not comfortable or confident in my cut. Well, then I can just change off into a point forward position and now play this other game. But if I get them in, they want to throw cuts at me, and they're going to position in a low guard, right? And now I can start with a cut and force them to engage with a broader action. Now I can pull that cut and do more things and strike in different angles at different times, right? So I've now opened up my game by expanding out with my distance and by prepping in an action where I'm going to be showing a cut to my opponent. I have some more flexibility in what I might want to try to do and how I might want to drive the fight in my favor. You'll see the same idea with Saber. This is the same reason why my Saber guard is what it is. It's here, right? My point is angled. If my point is forwards, I'm required to pull the point backwards before I throw a cut. But if I'm playing a cut-oriented game and I want my elbow loose and back, and even if my weight distribution is rearward, my elbow is prepped to make that cut. And when I make this cut, I'm not punching forwards with my cut. What I'm doing is making a rotation with my point and striking out in that same fashion as I did before. So you can see that my hand is leading and I'm making a small rotation. And even though I'm starting in a withdrawn guard, I'm still I'm opening and closing my hand, and that's what's giving me that little bit of momentum and rotation, so that as I throw it out there, there's just this, you can see that backward, just that a little bit enough of that backward momentum to turn, and here's the rotational point of my sword, and whop, I'm throwing out as I go. Boom. And either I'm cutting diagonally, or I'm cutting downward, or even if I'm cutting to the side, I'm still making that backward motion. I'm pulling a little bit backward. If I'm going to my left, I'm going to pull back a little bit to my right, and then strike to my left. I can pull back, and then turn and strike to my left. Or strike to my left.
We didn't cover hanging guards.
Yeah, we're going to do that in a second. Okay. The thing that sabering really brings into play, that Meyer touches on a little bit, especially the German rapier touches a little bit too, but the thing you see very much in sabering is the use of the hanging as a way to defend against blows, against cuts. We looked at the German idea of setting the blow off or of slicing it away with a cut, but most of Meyer's hand protection, most of Meyer's rapier guards are very minimal in the grand scheme of things. But when you're using a basket like you do, or even just the sail of a saber, there's a lot more hand protection on your hand. And what that allows you to do is use a lot more of this hand lifted hanging which can create slopes in your blade. And what does this do is it actually creates a new position available to me. Instead of this thrust-oriented position, I can start in a position where I can transition into a position where my elbow is prepped for a cut, and I'm also defending the entire side of my body, and via my arm, most of the other side of my body. And now I can rotate a cut very easily from here and bring it down with great momentum. So that even if I in a normal guard and my opponent then attacks at my head, I can hang and cover the entire line of defense and really easily and quickly return with a cut of my own that's being driven from the elbow. It's not a wrist cut because I'm not just turning it here, but because my elbow is bent and I'm turning all of that in, I get all the benefits of this big, strong, powerful blow, and I'm already prepped for it. So again, I can start in my guard, and when my opponent attacks me, I can hang. Attack me.
No.
I know, but I'm going to defend it. Go. Right? Here I go. I can hang, and then I can return very quickly inside of my opponent's defense and strike them in the head with a nice, strong, stable blow. This works incredibly well with sabers. It works okay with rapiers too, especially the shorter, broader rapiers like what Meyer's using. And what's really fun is I can hang on both sides. So if Panda's going to do the hanging against me, right? So start in guard, and then you're going to drop your tip and pull that over to defend against this. Boom, there you go. Push forwards. There, she's defended against my attack, right? And what's going to happen now is I'm going to slide off, and she's going to return that blow right into my head. Boom, just like I did to her. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the rotational momentum of my sword going. As it falls off, I'm going to lift my hand and hang the other direction. And again, completely defend my head all the way down to my back. Start in the guard so that I can have a target. Hang, boom. And now I can turn back the other way. Right? Want to do it again?
Yep.
Nice and smooth. Try to hit me here. It's the shortest place. Right? In fact, I'm not going to do the counter. You just hit me right here. Boom. Excellent.
Slid off on your shoulders, right?
That's good. Ready?
Yep.
Right? And the more I can keep my sword in between me and her, the less likely that's going to happen. One more time.
Yeah, that's that trading flank for
Yep.
heads.
That's that trading flank for head. One more. Same thing. I can just keep going from hanging to hanging. And eventually,
one of us messes up.
Right? So we can strike out and we can hang either direction, and by pulling that point down and the hilt up is what defends me. If I try to do that the other way and drive my point over, what ends up happening is I go over and I trap their sword in the space I'm trying to defend. So do the same thing slowly so we can see it. So to the hanging, and then come and cut at me here, and I try to do this. You see how I drive that sword because I did that, trying to dip my point this way. But what I want to do is, instead of dipping my point around, I want to let my point go and lift my hand. Same thing holds true on the other side. As I cut there, I want to let my point go this way and lift my hand to defend the whole side. Because what's going to happen is I'm essentially taking a table and flipping it one direction, right? Taking the table, flipping it the other direction. So the idea is let your point go low and lift your hand high and drive the edge in between you and their cut, and that's what keeps you safe. So you have hangings on both sides. The other really fun thing about hanging is we can use it offensively in many ways. So you'll see the English, this is sort of a, not we can look at English side sword, a short sword another time, to her back sword, right? But the English back sword, very similarly to sabering, uses that closed hilt. And so they use this guard, what they call the true guard, very, very frequently. Because again, we've got hand protection. So I can stand at measure and at distance in this guard, and I can be prepared for the initial cut. And I'm now limiting where my opponent, because anything over here is ridiculous for them to try to hit, right? They now have to drive in low against my flank, which is like the easiest place for me to defend and then put my point back into their face, right? And so I can start here, take away all of this stuff, especially I got a buckler here. Where are they going to hit me? The best place they can try to hit me is my arm. Okay, great. Right? I step in offensively. I just reorient to where they're going to hit me. And if you look at that from this side, you can see my arm is open. I just reorient now, close off that arm, and I can just lift my point up underneath and strike in at the chest. We see this at its height in 1699. Which is way post SCA period, and it is in the small sword era, or the spadroon era, in which a English gentleman by the name, or Scottish gentleman by the name of Sir William Hope, publishes the new short and easy method of fencing, which is not new, nor by how he describes it is it short, nor is it actually very easy. But essentially what he says with the small sword is by standing in a hanging guard in second, which is essentially here, I can stay defended by my sword either with the hanging guard second or the hanging guard in first. And I can approach my opponent behind my sword, and whatever they try to do to attack me, I can defend by pushing it away or transporting it into a cart, and then thrusting at them, or by letting it fall off and turning it into a cut. And so he uses this guard suppressively against an opponent. Let's can you do a French small sword, perhaps? Pretend to be snotty. Right, there you go. So French small sword. And I'm going to use this guard suppressively against my opponent by approaching, and you see what she has to do to get around my weapon is that whole big motion. Even when she tries to drive it in, it's very easy for me to push it away, and then I can step in with my own offense. I find I thrust people right in the belly, or maybe the other place, or I end up, if you do that same thing, do that same pressure, give that same pressure, so we're here, and we've crossed over here, and you make the pressure inside, I can turn that into what he calls the cart, right, which is fourth in French, and give a thrust of my own. Right, so, and you can see what she had to do to avoid my sword was make cuts over, and ultimately, if she gives me enough pressure, or falls off like this side, right, so let's say we attack in here, and I push, and you make the attack, make the lunge, I can then turn that over into my own cut in lots of different ways. I can defend against cuts, and I'm now in this hanging guard in second, or hanging guard in prima, and transitioning between these, which is really just an evolution of that back-swording true guard, so it's not new. He spends a lot of time describing the old system of fencing, so it gets really long-winded, so it's not short. And I will tell you this from experience, it takes some time to really get the time and distance down. Yep. It's not easy. All right. But there you have it.
All right, so an hour and 42 minutes later.
Yeah, well, this is a longer class.
This is a good class. And we have covered elbow cuts. Not everything about elbow cuts, but that's probably a good start. So, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, this is where we...
Because we fire hose you with a lot of information. Alright, so that's it for this episode and our look at elbow cuts. And join us in 2 weeks when we will work on shoulder cuts, continuing in our series of Pandas on Parade.